Florida, August 24th, 1992, 5 a.m. The winds arrived all at once, not gradually, not building, all at once. A wall of force moving at 145 miles per hour that hit Homestead Air Force Base like something deliberate, something that had been waiting. In the next 6 hours, the most powerful air installation in the Western Hemisphere was reduced to rubble. Hangars that had stood for 40 years, gone. F-16 fighters worth tens of millions of dollars scattered across the flight line like broken pieces. The air traffic control tower, the nerve center of the entire base, collapsed. One jet had its nose ripped completely off. By sunrise, there was nothing left. 8,000 military personnel, 50 years of history, gone in a single night. But here is what the official reports never told you. In the chaos of that night, certain areas of the base were sealed, not because of structural damage, but for reasons the Air Force has never fully put on the public record. Those areas remain restricted today. The complete inventory of what was stored at Homestead on the night Andrew hit has never been publicly released. The records are still classified. Stay until the end. Because what is still buried beneath that base changes everything about what the government said happened here. Homestead Air Force Base was established on September 16, 1942, a flat stretch of South Florida limestone, carved out of the earth and turned into one of the most strategically important air installations ever built on American soil. It started as a ferry airfield. Pilots trained there on C-46s, C-54s, and C-87s, aircraft that would carry men and supplies across oceans in a war the world was still learning how to fight. Then the war ended. The base closed. A hurricane in 1945 finished what the peace had started. Homestead sat in ruins for nearly a decade. But the Cold War changed everything. In 1954, the government sent an advance team back to the old ruins. By February 1955, Homestead Air Force Base was reactivated, this time as a strategic air command installation. B-47 Stratojet bombers arrived, then B-52H Stratofortresses, the kind of aircraft built to carry nuclear weapons across continents. Homestead was no longer a training field, it was a front line. But here is what almost nobody outside those gates understood about what was really happening inside them. October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Homestead Air Force Base sat 90 miles from Soviet nuclear missiles pointed at American cities. 90 miles, the distance from one end of a major city to another. The base swelled overnight. A tent city of more than 10,000 Army troops appeared on the airfield. The 31st Tactical Fighter Wing had already identified targets in Cuba and stood prepared to strike at a moment's notice. F-102 Delta Daggers from the Air Defense Command arrived. Surface-to-air missile batteries were positioned along the beaches at Key West. The world stood on the edge of nuclear war. Homestead was standing on the front lip of that edge. President John F. Kennedy landed at Homestead on November 26, 1962, weeks after the crisis ended. He came to look American air power directly in the eye. 72 fighter jets flew over him in formation above the runway. He stood on that tarmac and understood what that base meant. The crisis passed. The Soviets removed their missiles. But the changes Andrew spawned at Homestead never fully left. The base maintained a dual mission from that moment forward, strategic deterrence and tactical readiness that would define it for the next 30 years. By 1985, the first F-16 Fighting Falcons arrived, 2 full fighter squadrons, sleek, fast, combat-ready. By the summer of 1992, over 8,000 military personnel and their families lived and worked inside those gates. Schools, housing, a community built entirely around the mission of protecting America's southern edge. The Air Force called it a jewel. They meant it. But that's not even the most extraordinary part of this story. 4 days before Andrew hit, Homestead's meteorologists were watching a tropical system building in the Atlantic. It had been disorganized, weak. Forecasters believed it would turn north and stay well away from South Florida. Most personnel stayed on base. The base commander watched the forecasts carefully. As late as the afternoon of August 23rd, the storm still seemed manageable. Then everything changed. In the space of a few hours, Andrew did not turn north. It strengthened, rapidly, violently. An intensification that meteorologists would still study decades later because it happened faster than any model said was possible. By the time evacuation orders went out, time had already run out. The 482nd Fighter Wing scrambled. F-16 fighters were loaded and flown north to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The base commander pushed every aircraft and non-essential personnel out as fast as humanly possible. But not everyone left. Mission-essential personnel stayed behind. Commanders who refused to abandon their posts locked themselves into the strongest reinforced structures on the base and waited. Outside, the sky turned yellow, then green, then black. Here is what the official report says happened next, and here is what the official report leaves out. At 5 a.m. on August 24, 1992, Hurricane Andrew made landfall directly at Homestead Air Force Base. It was Category 4 at the time. Later it was reclassified Category 5. Maximum sustained winds were 145 miles per hour. Gusts were recorded at 175 miles per hour. It was one of the 3 most devastating hurricanes to strike the continental United States in the 20th century. And it hit Homestead dead center. The winds did not damage the base. They erased it. Hangars that had housed combat aircraft through the Cold War were torn open like paper bags. F-16 fighters were picked up and thrown across the flight line. One had its nose ripped completely off. Another was found in a building it had no business being inside. The air traffic control tower, the nerve center of every flight operation at Homestead for 30 years, came down. The personnel who had stayed behind pressed themselves into reinforced corners and listened to the world disintegrating outside. The sound was something they would spend years trying to describe to people who were not there. Most of them eventually stopped trying. By the time the sun rose on August 24, 1992, Homestead Air Force Base was gone. Not damaged. Not damaged severely. Gone. A reporter named Mike Clary was sent to the base by the Los Angeles Times in the weeks after the storm. What he wrote is still the most accurate account of what he found there. Windows were smashed out. Insulation dripped from shattered ceilings. The eerie evidence of former lives, clothing, furniture, medicines, breakfast cereals, sat moldering in the South Florida heat and humidity. A ghost town. 8,000 people had been there the day before. Now there was silence. Technical Sergeant Eugene Ritaldato had been away from the base on the night Andrew hit, on a weekend trip to Naples with his wife. He drove back as soon as the roads allowed. He reached what had been his home, near the base. His car had been pushed against the front wall of the house by the wind. His neighbor's car had become airborne. The house was destroyed. 3 days after he returned, his wife told him she was pregnant. Their daughter Gina had been conceived that same weekend. The same weekend, Andrew was born in the Atlantic. New life in the wreckage of everything they had known. But that was not the end of this story. What came next is the part they really did not want anyone to know. On September 2nd, 1992, 9 days after Andrew hit, President George H.W. Bush landed at Homestead. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney was with him. They walked through what was left. The people who were there that day still remember the expressions on their faces as they moved through the rubble. These were men who had witnessed a great deal in their lives. They were not prepared for what Homestead looked like. By that point, 23,500 additional military personnel from across the United States had arrived to assist with relief operations, the largest domestic military relief operation in American history up to that point. But behind the scenes, a different conversation was happening entirely. The Base Realignment and Closure Commission, the government body that decides which military bases live and which ones are permanently shut down, put Homestead on its closure list. The base that stood 90 miles from Soviet missiles during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The base where Kennedy stood and looked American air power in the eye. The base the Air Force called a jewel. Washington was going to shut it down permanently. The community of Homestead fought back. Local leaders, state officials, and federal representatives built a coalition and argued that permanently closing the base would be the final blow to a city already barely holding together. In May 1993, the hearings concluded. The list was finalized and sent to President Bill Clinton. Homestead was no longer on it. It would survive. But it would never be the same. We'll get to what is still buried beneath that base in a moment, because what investigators quietly documented in the years after the storm changes the official story considerably. On March 31st, 1994, Homestead Air Force Base was officially redesignated as Homestead Air Reserve Base. The 31st Fighter Wing, which had carried the base's active duty identity for decades, was deactivated. The full-time active duty installation became a reserve facility. F-16 aircraft came back. But the base that received them was not the same base that had sent them north to Ohio on the night Andrew hit. 165,000 homes in South Florida had been destroyed or heavily damaged. 250,000 people were left permanently homeless. The middle class of Homestead, built around the base and sustained entirely by the economic engine of the military installation, disappeared. Businesses that had served the military community for generations closed. Schools lost half their enrollment. Property values collapsed. What Andrew did in a single night took an entire decade to even begin to reverse. And something else did not come back. Something the official damage assessments of Andrew's destruction at Homestead never fully addressed in the public record. In the scramble to evacuate aircraft and non-essential personnel on the night of August 23rd, certain storage areas at Homestead were not fully cleared. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, certain sections of the base were sealed and restricted, the Air Force citing structural instability as the reason. But structural instability does not explain why those restrictions were maintained years after the physical structures had been rebuilt or demolished. It does not explain why the complete inventory documentation for Homestead storage facilities from August 1992 remains unavailable through standard declassification requests. And it does not explain why veterans who were stationed at Homestead in the late 1980s and early 1990s have raised consistent questions in interviews, in letters to representatives, in formal inquiry submissions about what was stored in certain restricted areas of the base in the years before Andrew hit. Those questions have never received a complete official answer. The records remain classified. Homestead Air Reserve Base exists today. The 482nd Fighter Wing still flies F-16 aircraft from that same runway. More than 1,500 reservists serve there. But here is what else remains. The base was originally built in 1942. It was destroyed by a hurricane in 1945 and then abandoned. It was rebuilt in 1955. It stood on the front line of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It grew into one of the most powerful active duty air installations in the Western Hemisphere. Then Andrew came, and it happened again. The name Hurricane Andrew was permanently retired from the Atlantic hurricane naming list after 1992. It will never be used again for another storm. It was only the second named hurricane in history to receive that designation, because what it did in South Florida was considered too catastrophic to allow any future storm to carry the same name. But the retirement of a name does not close a story. The base that guarded America's southern edge for 50 years still stands. The runway is still active. The F-16 aircraft still fly. But the active duty installation, the Cuban Missile Crisis front line, the base where Kennedy stood in formation review, the jewel that is gone. And the questions about what was inside those sealed storage areas on the night Andrew hit, about what the complete inventory would show if it were ever declassified, about why certain sections of the base remained restricted long after any structural justification had expired. Those questions are still buried, exactly where Andrew left them. If this story deserves to be remembered, subscribe to Buried America for more content like this.